Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational and entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. Hello, Jarna GHG from Finland. I'm sure I'm butchering that. Hello, people from Finland. Hopefully y'all are doing well. Forgotten toilet paper is waving. I'm waving. Wait, is that? Whoa, there's an emote that's me waving. That's pretty cool. That's great. You're absolutely right. Game in Lodges. It is Dr. K time. So welcome to another stream. I am super excited for today. So couple of things going on. I have an announcement to make. Something has happened over the last couple of days. I don't know if y'all were paying attention, but womp, womp, womp. 1 million subscribers. So over the last couple of days, we have reached 1 million subscribers on YouTube. This is a huge achievement, and it is our achievement. So when I say we hit 1 million subscribers, why do I use the word we? Is it because I'm just trying to be friendly and I'm sort of saying, oh, like it's we because like we're all in it together? No, but literally, I don't know if y'all understand this. I cannot hit 1 million subscribers on YouTube. I can't make 1 million dummy accounts and hit the subscribe button. To hit 1 million subscribers on YouTube is only possible, like literally only possible, if y'all are a part of it too. And I think this is actually huge because what it tells me, what it makes me happy about, what it makes me hopeful about, is that there are at least 1 million people out there who are interested in learning about themselves, growing a little bit, and making the world a better place. So we here at Healthy Gamer are all about AoE healing, and that involves y'all. It's not just Dr. K. And it will never be just Dr. K, and it's never been just Dr. K. And the awesome thing about our community, whether you look at YouTube, like subscribers or comments or whatever, is that like, if y'all read the comments on our videos, so much of the AoE healing doesn't even come from the video. It comes from like the participation, the sharing, the, comments, the supporting each other, the memes. And it's like really actually a huge sign because it tells me that the work that we're doing is important and that it's helping people and that we need to continue doing it and that there are at least 1 million people who are on board. So that is, when I say we hit 1 million subscribers, I literally mean we, right? So it's awesome that we've come this far. Who knows how far we'll go? I'm not really too focused on what's next. I think our attitude at HG has always been to just kind of focus for the most part on today. I mean, we do a little bit of planning for the future, but it's not about trying to hit 2 million or 5 million or whatever. It's about doing the actual work of AoE healing and trying to help as many people as possible. And if that number is 10,000, if it's 50,000, if it's 100,000, if it's 1 million, if it's 2 million, whatever, right? That's not actually the outcome that we're interested in. The outcome that we're interested in is what you can find in the comments of YouTube videos. It's what you see on chat. It's what you see on our subreddit. It's what you see on Discord, which is people slowly putting their lives together, getting control of themselves, and like starting to build a life that they're happy about. So thank y'all very much for all of your support. We really do appreciate it. It fuels the work that we do. It allows us to do more things, different things, better things, stuff like that. So we're very, very grateful. Okay, so congratulations, chat. Congratulations, everyone. Okay, so today we're going to be we're going to cover 3 things today, just to let y'all know. We're going to talk a little bit about how to open up and why opening up is hard. We're going to talk a little bit about sometimes we get into this trap of feeling like everything we do has to be super worthwhile. So sometimes we get like so paralyzed by like, oh my God, like I need to do like every moment of every day needs to be so worthwhile. I'm so behind. I've got a bunch of stuff to do. And then we can't afford to not be productive. And then the tricky thing is that since we can't afford to not be productive, that kind of overwhelms us and we end up procrastinating and then the whole cycle repeats. So we're going to dive a little bit into that. And actually, the first thing that we're going to start with is 5 productivity pitfalls. So let's actually kind of dive into that. So one of the things I want to talk to y'all about today is 5 productivity pitfalls. And what do I mean by pitfall? I mean that there's a lot of people out there who will talk about being productive. And what we tend to find is that people who talk about being productive, oftentimes the advice that they give is not actually going to be that helpful. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that, okay? So let's start talking a little bit about productivity pitfalls. Is burnout a pitfall of productivity? That's a great question, awesome Chad. So let me just pause for a second. So burnout is a little bit different. And in burnout, what we're kind of dealing with is a situation where we get a lot of I would say, kind of like negative feedback from our productivity, which then does not fuel our energy forward, right? So like what happens in burnout is that I invest a bunch of energy. As I invest a bunch of energy, I should get a particular kind of yield. And generally speaking, what happens when people burn out is that the yield that they get is not high enough to continue fueling them. So when we end up burnt out, what's going on is we're investing a bunch of energy, we're investing a bunch of energy, we're investing a bunch of energy, and we're oftentimes productive. We're actually producing something. The problem is that the feedback that we get from that production is insufficient. So that's kind of like, that's the problem. And then we run out of energy. And as we run out of energy, we're not really inspired to try to do more. We're not inspired to get up every day and work. And so then what we have to do is dig into our reserves to stay productive. And then we dig into reserves, and then we're staying productive, but we're not like recharging, right? So we dig in, we dig deeper until finally the gas tank is empty and we're screwed. Does that make sense? So burnouts, it's good. I mean, burnout isn't good. It's good that you're asking about burnout because it's very, very common, and we're starting to see more and more about it. There's a ton of actually interesting research over the last 2 or 3 years on burnout. Sometimes when I stream, I skip a word. So I'll say things like burnout is good. What I meant to say is it's good that you asked a question about burnout. It's good that we're talking about burnout. Oh man, so my name is Mythos is saying filling in paperwork and talking to the administration for hours is, yeah. Yeah, so great time for burnout research. Ideally, the best time for burnout research would have been like a decade or two ago so that we could have staved it off. But that's what happens. Generally speaking, we research things when they get out of control. Does burnout have to be work-related? That's a great question, Displacer Mizu. So the original definition of burnout that I think Christina Maslach if you look at the original paper on burnout, there was a paper by someone named Christina Maslach, who called something the burnout syndrome. And one of the key things at the time that people were sort of saying is burnout depression? And what Dr. Maslach said is actually, if you look at burnout, the key thing that separates it from depression is that it's work-related. So in the original definition of burnout, it is specifically something that's work-related. As we've dug into the concept and we've learned more about it, what we've started to realize is that there are attributes of it that are completely discrete from depression, and that there may be burnout that is related to other things besides work. So another good example of something that's kind of tangentially related is something that we call caregiver fatigue. So this is where if you look at patients with cancer, for example, life is rough on them, absolutely. But one thing that we're becoming increasingly aware of is that caregiver fatigue is a real thing. So it's not just the patient who has cancer, maybe their spouse is driving them to appointments, sitting with them at chemotherapy, and then when they go home, obviously the person with cancer is really exhausted, so then the other parent sort of picks up the kids, takes care of dinner, does all the housework and stuff like that. So there's a lot of caregiver burnout. We also tend to see that other examples of this are in therapy, for example. There's something called compassion fatigue, which is when a therapist just kind of is so compassionate all the time that they kind of run out of energy. That, once again, is work-related. So can sleep deprivation cause burnout? I don't really think so. It can certainly exacerbate burnout, but we tend to think about sleep deprivation and burnout as a little bit different. I have burnout of getting burned by my friends, quote unquote. Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's where the term gets tossed around. I mean, I think if you've had negative experiences with groups of people, then that's going to be, your mind is going to learn that we don't want to spend time with those people. So, out of mana. Yeah, Is there a connection to the burnout subculture? The kids in high school who skip class and are antisocial. So I would actually say probably the kids who skip class and are antisocial are not the burnout, what I would call subculture. The burnout subculture is usually people who are high performers. So the people who are most prone to burnout are actually people who care a lot about their jobs. So there's research on this, which shows that the proportion of burnout is going to be related to the amount of effort you put in divided by, times the yield that you get. So like the people who are the most prone to burnout are the ones who work the hardest and see the smallest result. So good example of very, very high burnout professions, teachers. So like teachers are a classic profession where they care a lot, right? And so they go the extra mile, they buy school supplies for their students. They oftentimes their students don't have like mental health support. Some of them are in abusive families. And so like teachers are actually dealing with a lot more than teaching. And they put in so much energy. And yet the teacher is not fundamentally capable of like fixing the problems that they're trying to help with. So if I'm a teacher and I have a kid who's like being physically abused at home and comes to school without proper clothing, proper school supplies, or even without food, I can only do so much. And the more I care and the more I try to bring lunch every day. I try to bring school supplies. I even get them some extra clothing so other kids don't make fun of them. I can do so much for this kid, but fundamentally, like, I can't fix their parents. I can't fix their home situation. So we see the highest level of burnout actually in people who care a lot and try a lot and feel like they run up against a wall. Yeah, so Obanya is saying, yeah, a former teacher friend went to work at Trader Joe's and is happier there. I think that's like kind of the unfortunate truth, is that a lot of times teachers are happier in different professions. But I think that's because we don't support our teachers well enough. Like they would love to be good teachers. Like I think it's hard. Is trying to survive is trying to survive and do nothing more burnout, Fushi Snow is saying. I wouldn't call trying to survive burnout. So here's what I'd say. So we got to talk for a second about just surviving. So a lot of times I'll work with people who are barely getting by. And they look at their lives and they're saying, okay, like we're barely getting by. I need to do so much more. And the thing is, I don't actually agree. I know it sounds kind of weird, but I think if we look at sort of the process of putting your life together, oftentimes there's actually like a period of just like barely surviving. And what I mean by that is if you just look at like the physics of acceleration, if I'm moving in the wrong direction and I want to start moving in the right direction, in the middle is going to be a period of zero velocity, right? And so like sometimes what I see is a lot of people who are just like barely surviving or surviving. They're not sinking on a day-to-day basis. And that's where we've got to remember that there's a difference between acceleration and velocity. That even getting to the point of just surviving can oftentimes be the result of positive acceleration. Because for a while, like maybe your life was actually moving in the wrong direction. And as we move from moving in the wrong direction to moving in the right direction, there's going to be a period of time where we're just surviving. And so sometimes I think that that's like the trickiest thing, is that if you're someone who's barely surviving, you can look at your life and you can say, I'm screwing up. But the truth of the matter is, all you really need to do is continue to barely survive, because the energy that is allowing you to barely survive will eventually start moving you in a positive direction. So sometimes barely surviving is like absolutely enough. I've also seen that a lot, it's been a couple years now, but when I was an attending psychiatrist, I would work with residents. And, so like residents would kind of come to me and they would say like, oh, I've got a patient and like, they're just getting by. And it feels like every week they're just getting by. And I feel like I've been working with them for 2 months, but like they're not getting better. And so it's important to think a little bit about, okay, critically, like, okay, could you be doing something different? Do you want to try a different tactic in psychotherapy? Maybe do you want to consider different medication? So it's worthwhile to not assume that you're doing a good job in that situation. But sometimes I think we forget as human beings that like just getting by is a key step to putting your life together. And so oftentimes in those situations, like explaining to the resident that this person just getting by is actually like way better than where they used to be like 2 years ago, right? They're barely able to make rent, but 2 years ago they were homeless. You know, they're not getting promoted. They're going to work every day. They're like not able to like get a raise, but they have a stable job and they can pay their bills. And so barely surviving is actually like quite an achievement. And so if you're in the situation of someone who's barely surviving, you know, I think you should be a little bit thoughtful about how you can move forward. But at the same time, don't beat yourself up, because barely surviving is actually pretty tough. If we think about a lot of people out there, like, you know, a lot of people out there who are very, very successful never had to barely survive, right? The people like, I mean, even I myself kind of fall into that category where I had some hard times in my life for sure. But, you know, I pretty much almost always had a roof over my head. I didn't have to worry about going hungry. There are a couple of periods in my life where, you know, that came pretty close to that. But for the most part, like, I had people who could buy me a meal. I had couches to crash on, things like that. So barely surviving, like, I had so many advantages. And a lot of people who are very successful have so many advantages that they never have to worry about barely surviving. And so if you're someone who's struggling to barely survive, you've really got to cut yourself some slack and recognize that this is part of the process, and that legitimately, like, your life may be objectively harder than a lot of other people. And so barely surviving when you've got a crappy hand of cards and you're still staying in the game is actually quite an achievement. Make sense? Yeah, so Karakala is saying, I had to learn not to judge me too badly and let myself learn. Absolutely. See, that's the thing, is that our mind, when we judge ourselves harshly, we don't judge ourselves based on our standard. We judge ourselves based on a comparative standard, a relative standard. Right? It's like, it's not fair the way we judge ourselves. Can we clarify barely surviving? I feel like you sometimes mean stuck in neutral. Moby1 TV. Yeah, so sometimes people who will describe themselves as barely surviving will be stuck in neutral. And sometimes people who are stuck in neutral won't describe themselves as barely surviving. I think it's a good point that you're bringing up, that there's like subtleties to the language, but what do I mean by barely surviving? That depends on the listener, right? So like, it depends on what people mean when I say I'm barely surviving, because I've met people who are relatively successful who feel that way. And I've met people who are not as successful who also feel that way. Isn't judging ourselves more harshly a tool for self-improvement? It is. So Abanya is saying, asking a good question. Isn't judging ourselves more harshly a tool for self-improvement? Absolutely. The problem is, how good of a tool is it? Right? I can use a fork to hammer in a nail if I really want to, but how effective is it over time? So I think self-judgment is what I would call dirty fuel for self-improvement. It's very polluting. It'll get the job done, but it'll cost you a lot in the long run. So the reason that we judge ourselves harshly, there's actually like this part of our brain that engages in something called contrafactual thinking, which is when it sort of looks at what we did, it looks at what we could have done differently, and that's one way that we learn. The problem is that when we engage in self-judgment, even when we succeed, we oftentimes don't feel satisfaction, right? So you got to think about this for a second, or talk to people who are very, very harsh self-critics. Do they ever get to relax? Not really. Because even when you get an A, it's like you didn't get an A+. Even when you get an A+, it's like, why couldn't you get an A+ last class? Right? So the problem with that self-judgment is that satisfying the self-judgment doesn't actually lead to like happiness or contentment. It does absolutely motivate you. And I've worked with a ton of medical students who are very, very harsh self-critics, which is part of the reason they're in medical school. Because an A+ wasn't enough. And so there are absolutely advantages, but I don't think that it certainly doesn't lead to happiness. And the really sad thing is that it is not a more effective success strategy than using cleaner fuels. So you can get the same amount of productivity by taking things with a different approach and get a lot of contentment. That's the really tricky thing about self-judgment, is it'll get you there, but you don't have to get there that way. And there are basically better ways to do so. Yeah. So Arwed Kidra is saying, discuss the 5 habits of productivity. That's a great segue. So let's hop back in. Okay. All right. So today what we're going to talk about are what I call 5 productivity pitfalls. What I've noticed is that there are a lot of people out there who will give like productivity tips and talk about success and talk about, like you got to grind and you got to do this. And like, these are all these secrets to success and productivity. But what I've actually found is that if you look at a lot of research, if you actually look at, different kinds of studies on productivity and things like that, as well as like studies on neuroscience and a fair amount of personal experience and working as a psychiatrist, what I've really found is that a lot of the productivity tips that people give, sort of share, are actually more pitfalls than tips. And what I'd love to do is share with you all 5 of those that, in my opinion, are kind of like debates, okay? So let's start with number 1. Number 1 is reading a lot of books. So there's sort of this idea that if you read a lot of books, you will be more successful, right? And that sort of makes sense because we know that books contain knowledge, and like knowledge is sort of a good thing. And the more that we know, doesn't that mean we're going to kind of be more successful? And so there's certainly value in books, like especially if you look at places like, medical school, where we do a ton of reading, and I've read a ton of books, and have I learned a lot from them? Absolutely. But I think what people sort of forget about reading a ton of books is that if you look at the way the science of learning, reading something passively doesn't actually increase understanding or doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. What really leads to good outcomes is like practical application of theoretical concepts. So if you look at medical school, for example, we'll read a bunch in the first 2 years, and then the second 2 years of medical school, at least in the United States, are in the hospital. And that's when you really start to learn medicine. The whole thing is that even after 4 years of medical school, then you go into residency, which is anywhere from like 3 to 7 years of practical application and training. And so a lot of people will sort of think, okay, like I'm going to read books, or if I was more productive, I would read more books, or I shouldn't read more books, or that person over there reads so much, they must be really amazing. But that doesn't actually increase your productivity or make you more successful. Because if you look at just variables on this stuff and logistic regression analyses, if you look at people who are successful and you kind of ask them what leads to your success, if you measure them, it's not like a whole lot of book learning actually correlates with higher levels of performance. So why are we so hung up on reading books? And there's an interesting psychological angle to this. So the first thing to understand is when we think about reading a book, we imagine that we'll get some kind of benefit by reading the book, right? So if I look at, let's say, the 7 habits of highly effective people, and I think to myself, okay, if I learn those 7 habits, then I will be a highly effective person. So we sort of look at a book and we associate that with a potential gain. And then if you're like me, sometimes you'll struggle to actually read the book, because reading books is actually hard, right? Especially because a lot of these like productivity books or self-help books will have very, very brief theses, and they'll kind of pad them with a bunch of stories to try to fill up 300 pages. But you can essentially summarize the book in like 2 to 5 pages. And so since books are hard to read, what ends up happening is, okay, if I read this book, I will get better in this way. But then it's hard for me to read, and so I never really finish the book, and I sort of assume that if I had read the book, I would have gotten better, I would have learned this. And then what happens is we look at someone else who has read the book, and then we kind of make an assumption that, oh, this person read that book, so they must have gotten better in that way that I was hoping I would get better in. And so as this kind of piles up, if you think to yourself, okay, if I read this book, I would be better at social skills. If I read this book, I would have better sleep hygiene. If I read this book, I would be better at emotional processing. If I read this book, I would know how to talk to my coworkers. So as you kind of like pile up all of these potential gains from books, and you never read those books, you think, okay, all of those are unrealized gains. And then you look at someone else who has read all of those books, and then you're thinking, oh my God, that person must be amazing at talking to their coworkers, have a good sleep schedule, do all of this amazing stuff. And so it's almost from our own pitfalls of not being able to read books that we sort of overvalue what books actually bring us. So I'm not saying that reading books is a bad thing. I read a ton. I, very much value reading books. But oftentimes we sort of think about books as like this singular activity that if we did a lot of, we would magically be better at stuff. And in my experience, books without practical application are actually not that useful. That there's a theoretical understanding there which you can absolutely get, but the real work is actually internal. So the real value of books is to sort of trigger an introspection, and as you go through that introspection, that's where the real yield comes from. And the other tricky thing is that if the yield comes from the introspection, we don't necessarily have to read the book to go through that process. So the first productivity pitfall is actually reading books, because at the end of the day, I don't know that reading 100 books makes you 100 times better at life. The second thing that I want to talk a little bit about, which is of growing interest and importance, is multitasking. So this is where we've got to be super careful, because generally speaking, a lot of people will value multitasking. They'll even take pride in sort of being able to do 1,000 different things at once. And there's absolutely value to being able to sort of parallel process, maintain multiple workflows. There's no question that being able to juggle a couple of things is useful. The issue, though, is that if you really look at the mind can literally only focus on one task at a time. So if you think about, let's say, the last time you took an exam, like you weren't working on 15 questions all at once, right? When you take an exam, you look at one question and you can only occupy one thing at a time with your mind. Even if you're at work, well, people will sort of talk about, okay, I'm multitasking during a meeting. You're kind of half paying attention to the meeting, half doing something else. And there may be like a part of the meeting that's a little bit useless. I'm not saying that it isn't. But even during the meeting, like when you're really focused on a particular task, you're not paying attention to the meeting. And if you're really absorbed in the meeting, you're not really able to work at the same time. So if we look at sort of multitasking, I think that managing parallel workflows is, generally speaking, like an important skill. But there almost seems to be this value judgment on being able to multitask over being able to single task. And the way that I'd kind of put it is like, if you kind of think about it, okay, let's say I'm an emergency room physician and I've got 15 patients in the emergency room and I'm kind of working on all of them. Is that useful? Sure. But it's not like the emergency room physician who's juggling 15 patients over the course of 5 hours is better than the neurosurgeon who's in a 5-hour surgery focusing on one patient. And even in the case of the emergency room physician, anytime they go in and they're seeing patient number 1, they're not actually thinking about patient number 15. In fact, when you look at studies of emergency room physicians who do that, those are the ones that actually make more errors. Right? So I'm not saying that parallel processing for multiple workflows is a bad thing, but generally speaking, we sort of value being able to juggle a bunch of things over focusing on one task. And if you literally look at the science of cognition, the brain can really only focus on one thing at a time. So I'd be super careful about multitasking, and especially prioritizing multitasking over focusing on a single task at a time. The next thing that I want to talk to you all about is where we start to get a little bit tricky. So this is going to sound kind of weird, but the next thing that I want to talk to you all about is having a side hustle. So when I hear a lot of these productivity people out there, these success gurus and stuff like that, they'll talk about having a side hustle. And this is sort of the idea that you've got one particular kind of work that you do and something that you devote yourself to, and then you do something else on the side to bring in extra cash to kind of like, optimize your time throughout the week. You kind of work in your full-time job for 40 hours a week, and then you got your side hustle here on the side for 20 hours a week. And generally speaking, I think side hustles are just a waste of time. And you may say like, wait, why can you say that? Isn't it like good to be hustling on the side all the time? And I don't really think so. So if you look at actually, what yields better outcomes or what correlates with like median income, it generally speaking is going to be advancement in a particular field. So for example, let's say I go to residency, right? So I'm a medical doctor, so I do advanced education and then I become a psychiatrist. If you look at different kinds of, subspecialties, subspecialty training, generally speaking, improves your earning power. Right? So I can go to medical school, I can become a general practitioner, and then I can become a cardiologist. And if I become a cardiologist, I'm going to double my income. So what we tend to see is that in any given profession, rather than investing, let's say 20 hours a week in a completely different field, what's oftentimes much more useful is investing any extra time that you have in building what you kind of initially have a foundation on. So if, for example, you go back and get an MBA, if you, for example, go get a CFA certification, or I've talked to people who've gotten mediation certifications, I've worked with programmers who've learned additional programming languages, as opposed to starting a real estate side hustle. And the key thing to remember is that society tends to value deep expertise in a particular area. It tends to value being an expert or having a particular niche. And if we think about the concept of a side hustle, I've got a foundation already that I'm building up on, and then now I'm going to start real estate over here, which then I'm going to start building from the ground up. And if you really look at sort of the yields on a given hour of effort, the higher up you go, the more you actually get from investing in that same kind of tower of a career. So I know that a lot of people will sort of emphasize side hustles and doing stuff on the side, but generally speaking, in my experience, it's been a lot better to just invest in what you're already doing and kind of like move from the 9th floor to the 10th floor instead of the first floor to the second floor over here. Now, there's an important caveat here, which is that even Healthy Gamer was a side hustle for me. So I'm not saying that side hustles don't have a place, but that, once again, I think the real place for a side hustle is that if you've got a particular career and you want to make a transition, this isn't something that's forever going to be a side hustle. The goal is to try to do something that you can transition into. Oftentimes, that's something where you can't really abandon one career and jump directly from one boat to another. This is where you've got to invest a little bit on the side and start to develop something. And as something grows, you kind of scale back. And this is something that I've tried to do a lot at Healthy Gamer, which is not have a full-time job and then Healthy Gamer on top. So as Healthy Gamer began to grow, I actually cut back on my private practice hours to like 20 hours a week and then 10 hours a week and then 5 hours a week. And so I'd be super careful about the idea that a side hustle is better than just investing in what you're already building. That brings us to productivity pitfall number 4, which in general is hustle culture. So there's this idea that the more you work, the more successful you will be. And this is a big part of hustle culture, right? It's like every hour of every day, I'm going to maximize my ROI. I'm going to be hustling. And it's like, it's people who put in 80 hours a week, 90 hours a week, 100 hours a week, 120 hours a week. Those are the people who are most successful. And I don't know how to say this, but like, if you look at the science of performance, that just isn't true. In fact, quite the opposite. So the first thing that I want y'all to think about for a second is that there are people who will work 80 hours a week. And those people who work 80 hours a week can be investment bankers, they can be resident physicians, they can also be fast food workers. I've worked with line cooks who will work 80 hours a week, 90 hours a week. And what they have to show for it is so much less than what an investment banker does. Even in terms of investment banking, if you look at things like private equity or venture capital or angel funding, angel investing, working more hours doesn't necessarily mean that you are more successful or more productive. Those two don't necessarily correlate. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't any correlation. So generally speaking, you have to put in a certain amount of time to be successful or productive in any field. But there's sort of this idea that working 80 hours, 90 hours, 100 hours, 120 hours is better than working 30 hours, 40 hours, or 50 hours. And this is where, if you look at the science of performance, we actually discover that that's actually not true. So let's understand that a little bit. So there have been some really interesting studies on this concept of what we call eustress. So we're all familiar with this term distress, which is that when the stress level that we're in gets so high that it actually causes a negative impact in our performance. But there's also the science of something called eustress, which is the optimal level of stress for performance. And basically, if you look at the science of eustress, what it shows is that if our stress level is too low, we get bored, right? So if I'm like, let's say I'm playing kickball with a bunch of 2-year-olds, I'm not going to play the best kickball of my life because I'm playing against 2-year-olds and it's just kind of boring and it's kind of completely lopsided and unfair and things like that, right? It's kind of like playing chess against a 3-year-old. Like, you don't have to use all of your faculties. So when our stress level is too low, we actually enter into the boredom state. And as we enter into the boredom state, we're not going to be as productive. As the stress level increases, as we get more engaged, we actually enter this period of eustress, which is this middle zone where we're a certain level of stressed out that we're actually mentally very activated and focused on the task. If we pass that eustress zone and enter the distress zone, that's when we start to feel overwhelmed, overworked, and that negatively impacts our performance. So for example, working 100 hours a week and sleeping 4 hours a night is probably going to negatively impact your performance versus working, 40 to 50 hours a week and sleeping 8.5 or 9 hours a night. This is something that I learned kind of in a sense the hard way in medical school, where I saw a bunch of students who were like studying for 10 hours a day. I tried to do the same thing. And what I sort of found is that my absorption or my recall really started to diminish after hour 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I was in such a perpetual state of exhaustion that the yield that I was getting from studying was incredibly low. Instead, what I did in med school is studied for just 2 hours a day first thing in the morning. And I found that when I studied for 2 hours at the beginning of the day, that my mind was so fresh and I was so focused that everything that I studied kind of really sank in. And then I would go to class and go to study groups and other things like that in the afternoon. And that would sort of be my repetition or reinforcement. But essentially what I discovered in medical school is studying more doesn't actually like correlate with higher test scores. There have even been studies on this where if you look at sort of what correlates with the best grades on tests, it actually comes down to organization and sort of blocking off particular periods of time for particular amounts of studying. So that's the next thing that so the fourth tip is that we essentially have got to be careful about hustle culture and this culture that sort of says working harder leads to more success, because I don't actually think that's the case. And the last thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is also something that I hear a lot from hustle culture, which is putting yourself first. So a lot of people out there will sort of say that, this is a dog-eat-dog world, and that if you want to get ahead in life, you've got to prioritize yourself. No one's going to look out for you, so you got to look out for yourself. Everywhere you go, it's all about you. It's all about your growth, your success. Life is a competition. It's a race, right? I'm behind and someone else is ahead. So there's this very competitive aspect of life where one person comes out on top and everyone else second through 100th place is no good, right? It's like that's sort of this attitude that people have where you got to put yourself first. And in my experience, that's actually not the case. Where what I've really found is that prioritizing other people in a lot of situations is actually the best thing in terms of your productivity and success. And I know this may sound kind of weird, but even the people who believe that, I think they believe it for a good reason, which is that it's been their experience. But I want to tunnel down into why people believe that and why that's their experience and why it's actually wrong. So if I prioritize myself, right, if I put myself first, what do you think the people around me, how will they respond, right? So if I'm a gunner and I'm going to be at the top of the class, I'm going to get straight A's, I'm going to get promoted, how will the people around me start treating me? How will they behave towards me? So as I very, very, in not a vocal, but even in a behavior kind of way, as people sort of figure out that I really am putting myself first, people are going to stop looking out for me, right? People are going to stop caring about me as much. They're not going to prioritize me. And so the interesting thing about putting yourself first and this idea that no one is going to look out for you, so you've got to look out for yourself, is that a lot of that actually comes from them looking out for themselves. So when I put myself first and I put everyone else second, they're going to actually do the same thing. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where this has been my experience that no one's been looking out for me, but that's because very vocally, I've only been looking out for myself. So why on earth would anyone look out for me when I make it very clear that I don't give a shit about them? Just think about that for a second, right? So in my experience, actually, this is a huge productivity pitfall. That if you're always looking out for yourself and you're kind of number one in every situation, then other people are going to stop looking out for you. And if other people stop looking out for you, that's going to create all kinds of problems in terms of lack of professional opportunities, in terms of people not asking you for help, in terms of all kinds of things. And in my experience, sort of prioritizing other people can actually lead to a lot of good outcomes. So when I care about the people around me and when I'm sort of willing to make sacrifices for the benefit of people around me, people appreciate that. People, in some way may want to repay you. People may start looking out for you. People maybe have access to opportunities that you may be a good fit for, that they're not a good fit for, and they'll pass those kinds of opportunities along. I think a good example of this is networking. So everyone's like, oh, you got to network to get ahead. You got to network to get ahead. And there's absolutely a lot of value to networking. But I think the attitude when you go into a networking situation can drastically alter what outcomes you get. So when I go into a networking situation, I don't go into those situations thinking, okay, what can this person do for me? What can this person do for me? How can I get ahead? What I tend to go to networking situations for is trying to help people. So everywhere I go, if I'm sort of in a networking situation, I'll sort of try to help people, and I'll try to think, okay, like, how can I be helpful to this person? Are there opportunities that I know of that could help this kind of person? And I will actually sometimes prioritize people ahead of myself. And in my experience, that actually works really well. So you got to be really careful about people who sort of talk about, okay, you got to put yourself first because ain't no one going to watch out for you. Now, I don't think that you should always put other people ahead of yourself. I think you should look out for your own opportunities and take opportunities. And when other people offer you opportunities, you should accept them with gratitude if they're aligned with what you want to do. So we're not saying be a doormat. We're not saying always put yourself last or always put yourself second. But I do definitely think it's incorrect to always put yourself first. So just to kind of summarize, I think there's a lot of information out there about productivity pitfalls. There are a lot of people out there who will say a lot of things about productivity and success. And you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this, and you got to do this. If you do these kinds of things, then you will be productive. You will be successful. And in my experience, a lot of that stuff just isn't accurate, and the science really doesn't support it. The first on the list is reading books. And so I'm a huge fan of reading books. I have a gigantic bookshelf with probably, y'all can see in the back, like I've got probably 200 to 300 books in my office, and I've read most of them, and there's a lot of value to it. But the key thing is that reading a book in and of itself does not actually lead to behavioral change or any kind of concrete improvement. It's the application of the book knowledge that actually leads to progress. The other thing to remember is that there are oftentimes many alternatives to reading books that will allow you to better apply those principles. A simple example of that is you can read a book about trauma, or you can go see a therapist who focuses on trauma. And those two things will yield very, very different outcomes. The second thing that we want to watch out a little bit for is multitasking. So it's absolutely important to sometimes be able to juggle parallel workflows, or to be able to, on a macro level, work on multiple tasks at a time. The key thing to remember, though, is that your brain can really only focus on one thing at a time. And in fact, the more split your focus is, the worse your performance is going to be. If we think about forgetting things or messing something up, what we tend to find is that people who are more distracted, i.e. thinking about other things, are the ones that actually make more mistakes. So we understand this in terms of surgical outcomes, and you can sort of understand it yourself where, like, I don't know if y'all have ever watched a TV show or movie while you're on your phone. And if you're on your phone, you're going to enjoy the movie or TV show less, and you're going to enjoy whatever you're doing on your phone less. So what we tend to find is that distracting the mind actually leads to poorer outcomes. The third thing to think a little bit about is having a side hustle. And this is where a lot of people will talk about, having a side hustle because that's where you make that extra money. It's sort of like on the side, it's extra, it's great. But oftentimes, if you look at what actually correlates with the best median income, it's usually investing in your primary professional foundation. So whether that's sort of getting an advanced degree, whether that's something like doing a fellowship or additional trainings, there's a lot of stuff that if you've already built a foundation, moving from floor 5 to floor 6 and floor 7 is going to be worth more. Investing 20 hours and sort of moving up 2 floors is going to be worth more than a side hustle where you're kind of starting at the bottom and building from the ground up. There are absolutely situations where side hustles can be useful and good. So I myself started Healthy Gamer as a side hustle, but at some point, you want to make that transition. And the goal of a side hustle, I really think the ideal situation for a side hustle is when you're sort of trying to experiment with something, but you don't want to kind of give something up over here. The next thing to talk about in general is hustle culture, and this core idea that to be more productive and more successful, you've got to put in more time. Whereas in my experience, it's just not like that. So if you look at something like the science of eustress, what we sort of discover is that happy, healthy, well-rested, focused, appropriately challenged individuals are the ones that sort of yield the best performance. And I've even done corporate consulting at major companies where we sort of try to emphasize this, right? So why do places like investment banks why do they call me in? It's to help them sort of adapt their culture to actually having like happy, healthy, appropriately challenged employees. It's not trying to get people to work 80 hours, 90 hours, 100 hours a week. What are the carrots or incentives that we can use to get people to work more and burn out? That actually doesn't yield the best outcomes. I've done a lot of work, especially with things like job turnover, where in the financial industry, sometimes like there's some investment banks that have very high turnover. And so they work people to the ground, and those people end up leaving because they get good opportunities elsewhere. They're high performers. And since they're high performers and they're being treated like crap, they're going to move somewhere else where they'll be treated a little bit better. And once that person leaves, you're sort of left with this issue of like having to train up an entirely new person, which costs you a ton. So working harder isn't necessarily better. And in fact, there's a lot of research that shows that working a decent amount is actually the best way to get optimal performance. The last thing to think a little bit about is that a lot of people who are sort of productivity success gurus will sort of talk a little bit about you got to put yourself first. No one else is going to look out for you, and it's a dog-eat-dog world, and you got to look out for yourself. And while I think that you should prioritize yourself at times, I think you've got to be super careful because they sort of are engaging in a self-fulfilling prophecy, whereas if I'm looking out only for myself and I always come number one in my book, other people will stop caring about me. Other people will stop trying to help me because if I'm only looking out for myself, there's going to be no reciprocity. So oddly enough, in my experience, if you actually try to help the people around you and you sometimes, go out of your way to help someone, and even if you don't get anything for it, like if you help another human being out and they're never able to return the favor, and you spend 5 hours of your life trying to guide someone who's 10 years younger than you, and you get no compensation for it, oh my God, what's the ROI on that investment? It's nothing. You didn't get any ROI from helping out another human being. Oh my God. Turns out that sometimes helping human beings is just like okay to do, and you don't need to optimize your ROI. You can actually make the world a better place. You can actually try to help someone else out and make life a little bit easier because Lord knows it ain't easy enough, right? So these are common things that I think I would encourage y'all to be a little bit more critical about. Some of these truisms of productivity or success, which in my experience they're just not that true. So think a little bit critically about it, and let's take a look at some questions. Swemini is saying, helping others out without gains? No, absolutely. Yeah, this altruism crap is really lowering the ROI on the stream for me. Yeah, so LJ Dude 516 is if you need to justify it with an ROI, someone else being better off automatically applies to the overall average and will eventually increase overall happiness. That's a great insight, right? So that's the key thing about trying to help out other people is that if you think about it, the total ROI is probably positive and probably overwhelmingly so. It's like if I know how to change a tire and someone else doesn't know how to change a tire, and I teach them how to change a tire, it turns their time investment from 5 hours into 1 hour. It costs me 1 hour. So we're spending 2 hours for a 5-hour investment. They just see the lion's share of that. And this is the whole thing about being a little bit altruistic is like, once people recognize that, they're going to try to help you out too. And that's where things just get better. So Hobday Train is saying mentoring others is the best way to cement your own skills. Bettering skills leads to more money, better offers, more PTO, etc. That's the other thing. I tend to agree with that, right? So even in teaching and helping other people out, you're probably getting something out of it as well. Okay, so new 1T is saying the time commitment is a tricky one. There are deadlines and all sorts of things. if you can stop at 2 hours, how can you reach your productivity ceiling? That's a great question. And I think this is the key thing. What are the variables that involve reaching your productivity ceiling? And what is the amount of hours worked? So let's like take that all the way to the extreme. So if you want to reach maximal productivity, why don't you just stop sleeping, right? So why don't you work 24 hours a day, 5 days a week? Why don't you work just like 120 hours a week? Like just give up sleep, right? You'll be more productive. Because how are you going to reach the productivity ceiling of 120 hours if you're sleeping? Like sleeping is the worst ROI. So the key thing to understand is that a productivity ceiling is, first of all, not necessarily correlated with a certain amount of time. If we're talking about it, like what's the output? So another good example is I tend to do a lot of writing. And what I tend to find is that like if I set things up properly, I can bang out 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 words a day. Like, but it has to be set up properly. Like I have to write first thing in the morning or sometimes late at night. So I have like particular windows of writing. And there's a lot of research on circadian rhythm. And we kind of talk a little bit about like, you know, there's like different times of the day where we're mentally active, physically active, stuff like that. So this stuff we've explored a lot in Ayurveda. So they have a very, very detailed exploration of what activities should be done during what time of the day, and also for particular types of people. But Ayurveda hasn't been that well scientifically validated. So let's look at Western science, where we also know, for example, that visual acuity is the best at dawn and dusk. So why do sunsets look so beautiful? So if y'all want a simple exercise, go out during the noonday sun and look at a tree. Go out at dusk and look at the same tree. And what you'll find is that the tree at dusk is much more vivid. The colors are a lot greener and like you can see so much better at that time. And so why is that? It's because our eyes have evolved to be active during dawn and dusk. So mammals in general tend to be active around dawn and dusk. Apes and chimpanzees also will be active at dawn and dusk. If y'all have like sort of visited places where there are monkeys, you know that the monkeys like start around 4 or 5 in the morning, right? They're not like making noise all night long. And then during the afternoon, like when it's hot outside, like they're not making a whole lot of noise. And during the evening, they become active again. So then the question, we know that, for example, eyes will be like optimal acuity during that time of the day. Then the question becomes, are the eyes the only thing that is optimally functioning during dawn at dusk? And the answer is obviously not. So even cognition and mental work during certain times of the day can be more optimal. So this is where like it's interesting, because if you look at the question, if you stop at 2 hours, that presumes that your output, your measure is hours. But the real measure should be output. What are you trying to accomplish? And then what's the minimum amount of time that you can take to accomplish it well? Okay, Amit Facian is saying, how do you deal with overwhelming burnout from being way behind others your age and even those much younger than you, feeling like you'll never catch up because you spent your entire life putting everyone else first? Great question. This actually relates to one of the topics that we're going to talk about today. So let's do that. Okay. One moment. I'm going to go turn on the air conditioner because it is hot. Did y'all enjoy the chair stream? Chair stream is POG, right? Sus. Dr. AFK. That's great. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Dr. AFK. What do you mean refuses to elaborate? I said I'm Dr. AFK. Sponsored by IKEA. That's great. We should totally get IKEA as a sponsor. So we're super careful about sponsors and stuff. We've got some interesting sponsorship opportunities. Dr. K gambling stream, anyone? We get some, but I kind of think it would be cool to be sponsored by like IKEA. Like I could totally get behind that because as y'all know, like I'm a believer in the product. Right? Sponsored by Amazon. I am also a believer in Amazon products and services. Dude, it'd be cool to be sponsored by a nation. That'd be neat. Drop me stuff, lost a train of thought. Hell yeah, I did. Dr. K, can you please become the next Sadhguru? Sadhguru is too old now. Hey, hey. I certainly hope not. I think Sadhguru can do his thing. I don't think that... We decided a while ago that we're not going to, go down that route. But, we'll see. Okay, stay hydrated, chat. This message brought to you by water. Okay. Let's do our next thing. Okay, I give y'all choice, chat. What next? Do y'all want to talk about... We'll do both of these. So I need everything to feel worthwhile is one of them. And the other one is... Do we have mod check? Mod champ? So I need everything to feel worthwhile. Can't waste any time. Or how to have the courage to open up. What do y'all think? What do first? We'll do both. We're going to do both. I've learned this lesson already. I don't give y'all choices where we're not going to do either, unless we get like completely derailed. Small chance we'll get completely derailed. Okay. All right. Worthwhile it is. Okay. Do the first one second, the second first. Okay, open. Okay, well, are we going to do meditation day? We're sure going to try. Just depends on timing. Depends on how much y'all distract me. Snooze cruising? All right, let's go. Okay, we're going to do everything worthwhile. I need everything to feel worthwhile. Whenever I'm doing, well, anything really, healthy or unhealthy, I have this issue where I need everything to feel completely and totally worthwhile. As of late, I felt it becoming increasingly problematic for being both productive and healthy. Essentially, I set out with a goal of some kind, and if I don't complete them, I either waste absurd amounts of time trying to complete those goals, or have a heavy damper on my mood for the rest of the day, which stops me from getting anything done. There are some situations that I think are worse than others. Trying to meet people, for example, has been coming up a lot since I'm just starting college. On days where I haven't met as many people as I liked or had a good conversation with anyone, I end up in a very drained state where I can't get a lot of schoolwork done. I feel like I just want to go home and sit around for a day, playing video games or doing something generally easy. Usually by the next day, I feel fresher. However, there are times where I feel like this need for things to be worthwhile has been borderline addictive. Most recently, I've been spending hours staying up playing this gambling This gambling on a game I play to earn credits. It's not real money, and there's zero benefit to having the currency aside from saying that you have a lot. Still, I keep playing. When I lose a bit, I feel a need to earn my way back up and end up driving myself further into holes. I get that gambling can be like that, but I find it odd that I'm so hooked even though the money has zero value. I've also recognized it as a problem with porn usage, which is a problem I've been actively trying to deal with. Whenever I relapse, though, I get into this mindset of I won't be doing this for a while again and binge really hard until I feel satisfied. I was wondering, does anyone else feel this way? How do I have this need for productivity affect me less harmfully? Is this a healthy mindset in any capacity? So let's kind of take a quick look at this. So this is a situation where someone needs to feel like everything they do is worthwhile. So oftentimes you've got a particular thing that you want to accomplish and you want to use your time productively, right? Like that's obvious. So we want to use our time productively because then we're like good people, we're healthy people, we're successful people if we use our time productively. So let's be productive. Everything's got to be, I can't waste any time. And then what happens is if everything we have to do needs to be productive and we can't waste time, something weird starts to happen. If we don't live up to some of our expectations, we'll either waste a lot of time trying to accomplish these goals because we got to do it, right? Or we'll have a heavy damper on my mood for the rest of the day. And then what happens is we'll oftentimes get into these situations where we're not quite sure what's going on. And then we fall into all these other kinds of behaviors like playing video games, doing gambling stuff, pornography. So let's try to understand what's going on here, okay? So let's try to break down, first of all, where does the feeling that you need to do everything worthwhile come from? Secondly, how do we sort of manage that feeling? How do we deal with it? Thirdly, what are the consequences of this whole cycle, both psychologically, neurologically, reinforcement-wise? And lastly, like, what do we do about it? Okay, so let's take a look. Oh. There we go. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about, so everything has to be worthwhile. Let's take a look, okay? So the first thing that we're going to talk about is where does this idea come from, all right? So generally speaking, I exist. And then what happens is when I go about living my life, I will create an expectation in my mind. So this person, for example, will talk about, let's say, I'm in college, and so on days where I haven't met as many people as I liked or had a good conversation with someone, I end up in a drained state. So let's try to understand what that means. So we create an expectation for ourselves. And then let's say we start here and we try to live up to that expectation. If we live up to that expectation, fantastic. But if we fall short of the expectation, this window leads to disappointment. Now, once we have this emotional disappointment, which remember is a feeling, our brain, let's just make myself disappear for a second. Once we have this emotional disappointment, what we're going to do is cope with it, okay? So this is how the brain sort of deals with emotions. We have to do coping. Let's bring myself back. So let's take a look at that. So once I feel emotional disappointment, let's say this is shame, right? So like feeling like I've fallen behind. Look at all those other people. I start making comparisons. All those other people are making friends and I'm not making friends. And then once I start to do that, I have to deal with these emotions with like some kind of emotional, let's make sure we record, by the way. Oh, okay. Can't record. So I have to deal with all these negative emotions with things like video games, gambling, pornography. The unholy trifecta. And this person even points out that even when I'm gambling, there's no real money involved. So why do I keep doing it? I'm not really gaining anything. And that's because that makes sense, actually, interestingly, because when it comes to gambling, for example, our brain has certain like circuits that get activated when we gamble. And when we activate these circuits when we gamble, they actually suppress our limbic system. So it doesn't matter whether the money is real or not. Like the act of gambling and the random reinforcement schedule and getting some kind of victory is sufficient in suppressing the limbic system. So this explains why even if you're not getting any money, you're still going to be gambling, because it's doing the gambling is doing the job that it is set out to do, which is to deal with all of this emotional disappointment. And so what I would imagine we'd see in this person is that the more they fall short of their expectations, the more they engage in this sort of gambling behavior and falling behind and all this kind of stuff, pornography, video games, etc. So now we've got another issue, which is that once I've fallen short, this translates into the future. So if I've fallen short by this amount, let's say, what that means is that going forward, where can't I? There we go. Going forward, I start at a deficit, right? Because I kind of messed up. So I started a deficit. So now when tomorrow rolls around, let's say here's the baseline, here's what I want to accomplish, here's the expectation, but I'm actually starting over here. So since I only made one friend yesterday, I actually have to cover this whole distance. So even if I move from here to here, let's say I do this much. How does it feel? How much have I fallen short? Now I've fallen short by this amount. Right? So even though I made progress, it feels like I fall short. And then this carries over to next time. Now this is below the baseline. Now today, I have to do this. And now let's say that I work extra hard, right? So yesterday I did this much. Today I'm going to do this much socializing. That's a lot more. But where am I? Now the gap is this much. And so something very bizarre starts to happen, which is that if you really look at this, this is progress. This is progress. This is progress. This is progress. All of these are progress. So now we're in trouble because despite progress, despite actual progress, we feel like we're failing. Now, once we feel like we're failing, enter the pornography and gambling and video games, gaming, etc. Now we're in a lot of trouble because when progress does not positively reinforce behavior, where does that leave us? That's a huge issue. Because even though I'm doing all the right stuff, I don't feel any sense of accomplishment, which in turn means that I'm not going to be reinforcing the actual behavior that's improving my life. And this is how you get stuck in this trap. And the bigger this grows, this gets so big that eventually everything you do has to feel worthwhile. I cannot waste 1 second of a single day because I've dug myself into such a pit that I need to be extra productive every moment of every day. Every time I go out, I need to make 10 friends. Every time I go out, I need to make 15 friends. Every time I study, I need to get an A+. It all needs to be, I've wasted so much time. This gap is so big. Oh my God. How do you make up for this gap? Everything has to be worthwhile. Because if I'm so far behind, I can't afford to waste any time. So this is something that's kind of interesting. People who are successful can afford to waste time. People who are behind cannot afford to waste time. The more in the hole you are, the less your time is worth, the more miserly you are about it. It's huge irony. Think about it. Right? So if I'm behind, if I'm 28 years old and I haven't graduated from college and I don't have a job, how much is my time actually worth? Not very much. If I'm 28 years old and I'm in surgical residency, how much is my time worth? It's worth objectively more. Who feels guiltier taking vacation? The 28-year-old who doesn't have a job, whose time is worth objectively less than the surgeon's, or the surgeon who's 28 and can't wait for a vacation? And so now we get into a lot of very interesting problems. The first problem that we've already talked about is that despite progress, we feel like we're failing. The second problem is that we become miserly with our time. And as we become miserly with our time, we can't take chances. If we can't take chances, we become paralyzed in terms of options. I can't even apply to college because I need to get in. So the application has to be perfect. If the application has to be perfect, I have to spend so much longer on it. I can't afford to do good enough. This leads to paralysis. The more we get paralyzed, the more further behind we fall, and the more we end up being miserly with our time. And if you can't experiment, you can't take chances, it's really hard to dig yourself out of the hole. The last thing, which we've also kind of talked about, is that the more that 1 and 2 pile up, the more we end up with emotional coping mechanisms. So we've covered this kind of gambling, gaming, etc. And the problem is that these in turn make it harder to actually make progress, right? So these then sabotage us. So what do you do about this? First thing, abandon expectations. So this whole thing starts with this idea right here. So here's my starting point. Here's my expectation. If I move this amount, this is falling short. If I have no expectation, this is all a win. We started today here, we ended today here, this is a win. If I have an expectation, this is a loss. Do you all get that? This is mind-blowing once you really get it. That the same amount of effort or progress can lead to positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, all based on the expectation. So there's kind of a corollary to abandoning expectations is you can't fix you can't fix yesterday's problems today. So let me put it to you this way. If I'm 28 years old and I'm applying to college, or I'm thinking about applying to college, and then I think to myself, oh my God, I don't know if I should apply to college because I don't know what to major in. What if I major in the wrong thing? And then I spend 4 years in college, and then I'm 32 and I have the wrong major. Then I'll have wasted 14 years of my life. So I can't afford to get into the wrong major. I have to figure out what's the right major. So then I end up doing research. I never apply. I'm trying to figure out, okay, what's the career? What do I do with my life? I'm stuck. But the key thing is that you're 28. You've already wasted 10 years. You've got to call that L. You got to eat the L. There's nothing you can do today that will make up for the time that's already passed. And it's our attempt to make up for the time that's already passed that really creates the problem. That's what actually paralyzes, because how can I afford to lose 14 years when if I've lost 10? But we don't think about it as losing 10. We think about it as, okay, if I make it worthwhile, then those 10 years may not have been a waste. We try to get those years back. And that burden becomes so impossible, because how do you make a decision for a major that makes up for 14 years of spent time? Impossible. You set yourself up for failure. So whatever you've screwed up in the past, you've screwed it up. It's over. Let it go. Can't fix it. That hurts though. Oh my God, like you're telling me it was a waste? Like, I'm not telling you it's a waste. You're the one who's telling me it's a waste. All kinds of benefits, but you refuse to see them because you're trying to make up for it. Make sense? So you can't solve today the problems of yesterday today. Last thing. This is kind of general, but be careful about operating from a feeling. So we've got to be super careful about letting our feelings dictate our actions. So let's take a quick look at this post and understand. I end up in a very drained state where I can't get along. I feel like I just want to go home and sit around for a day, playing video games. Next day, I feel fresher, right? I have this issue where I need everything to feel completely and totally worthwhile. Like, how does gambling make them feel? So even this, I get into this mindset, I won't be doing this for a while and binge really hard until I feel satisfied. So what is dictating all of this person's actions? When do they stop? When they feel satisfied, right? They need to feel worthwhile. So I want you all to just imagine for a moment what this person's life would be like, what your life would be like, if feelings did not dictate your actions. Then what? It's fine that you feel a particular way. We're not saying that you shouldn't feel that way. But does the feeling need to dictate the action? I need everything to feel worthwhile. Can you do it anyway? Can you even do it if it doesn't feel worthwhile? What would start to happen in your life if you stopped using pornography until you felt satisfied? What would happen in your life if you didn't need to have things feel worthwhile in order to do them? I feel like I didn't make enough friends today. I feel like I need to make a ton of friends at this party because I need to make up for being a shut-in for the last week. What would happen if that feeling no longer controls you? So you have to acknowledge that it's just a feeling. It's not truth. It's just a feeling. We're not saying it's false, but all it is a feeling. It's not a law of nature. It's just how you feel in that moment. And you may say, okay, but Dr. K, that's hard. You're correct. It is hard. Yogis in ancient India spent years, if not decades, mastering their feelings. So what chance do you have? Pretty good one, because you're basically equipped with the same stuff they are. You're a human. It's a very simple thing you can do if you want to know, okay, how do I not let my feelings engage with actions? How do I not be controlled by my feelings? One very simple meditative exercise that you can do. There are various versions of this, so I'm going to share with you all a couple. The first is that the next time when you start ordering food, order it to not be perfect. So let's say that I want to eat a bacon cheeseburger. I'm going to order a bacon cheeseburger for lunch. So instead of getting a bacon cheeseburger, get either a bacon burger or a cheeseburger. Just cut out one thing. Like if you want to get ice cream with sprinkles, cut out the sprinkles. In more extreme versions, if you like your burgers without tomato, get it with tomato. Either add something that you don't like or remove something that you do like from the equation. And then you will say, oh my God, this is insane. Are you telling me not to eat my favorite food? No, you can still eat the food. We're not saying deprive yourself entirely. We're just saying instead of shooting for perfect satisfaction, shoot for less than perfect satisfaction. So what you want to start doing is allow yourself to do things that you don't feel like doing. Now, in more extreme versions, you can also do things like, adopt more specific diets and things like that. But just start by not giving into your feelings in some small way. And we're not saying make it drastic, right? Don't order your least favorite thing on the menu. You can still order things that you like. Just try to make it less than perfect. And as you do that, what you'll start to learn is that you're going to feel like you want that bacon. I don't want tomato on the sandwich. I don't want it. Okay, well, so what? You can still eat it. It's kind of bizarre. So if you're stuck in this cycle of everything has to be worthwhile, first of all, understand where it comes from. That it's born from expectation. It's born from the things that we carry over from yesterday and put on today. And fundamentally, it's born from our inability to separate actions from feelings. And if you can do those three things, then you will be able to do things that are not worthwhile. And it'll be like freeing. It's like liberating to be able to do this. Because right now we're so controlled by our feelings. Right? I'm triggered or upset by people using a particular phrase. So I need everyone else to stop talking. I'm not saying that hate speech is good or anything like that. Please do not interpret it that way. There's still bad things and, you shouldn't say things that hurt other people. But at the same time, just think a little bit about right now what's happening in the world is that we're surrendering our happiness and peace of mind to the actions of others. Instead of training ourselves to be able to tolerate and be undisturbed by someone else's venom, we're actually starting to open up and let them affect us. We're surrendering control of our own happiness to the words of other people. Now, this is an important caveat. I'm not saying it's okay to say hurtful things. So we should still hold people who engage in hate speech and things like that accountable for saying harmful things. But what I'm saying is that there's a side to this story that we haven't engaged in, which is personally being able to withstand toxicity. Recognizing that this person can use whatever words they want to, but I'm not going to be happy or unhappy based on what this person says. Think about that for a second. Are we surrendering control of our peace of mind to the words of another human being? I'm not saying it makes it okay. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be accountability for actions. That's completely different. You can hold them accountable and still be internally peaceful. Questions? So does that mean I don't care about what they say? So not caring implies apathy. I don't think that you should not care about what they say. I'll give you all an example. So let's say someone says something hurtful to me. Now, it can hurt to hear it, right? But then I've got a couple of different options. I can tell them not to say this, which may be completely reasonable. So I'm not saying don't do that. But internally, I've got a couple of options too. I can start to think a little bit about, okay, is this true? Do I agree with this person? Where is this person coming from? Why are they saying this? Is it possible they're saying it just because they've had a bad day? And so sometimes when people criticize us, their criticism has a lot more to say about them than it does to say about me. Sometimes it says a lot about me. So that's where we've got to be a little bit critical about the process, but then we may sort of realize at the end of it that, okay, this person is, so I've worked with people who are addicted to substances. They have histories of addiction and they'll be prescribed controlled substances. So sometimes they'll be on like opioid maintenance treatment, like Suboxone, and then they lose their Suboxone. And they get very, very angry at me because I won't prescribe it again because they lost it. Who knows? Did they lose it? Did they abuse it? I don't know. And so there's a protocol around what's appropriate for prescribing, what isn't. And then depending on how they feel about it, they can start getting really nasty. And then I can decide how I deal with their words. So do I want to hold them accountable if they say things that are disrespectful? I'll tell them that. I'll say, look, the way that you're talking to the staff today is not acceptable. They're here to help you. And I understand that you lost your Suboxone. That's not their fault. It's not okay to talk to people like that. And also, I don't have to be mad about it. I don't have to be like, oh my God, this person is such an asshole. All addicts are bad. And like, oh my God. No, it's like that person, like, they've got an addiction and it sucks because they're now going to be going through withdrawal. I should be compassionate and I can still hold them accountable. Does that make sense? So it's about being like internally okay with yourself when someone says something that's harmful. Doesn't mean that we want to allow them to say things harmful. That's like a subtlety that I think is lost on the internet. That you can hold people accountable for actions while still being compassionate towards them and not letting them hurt you as best as you can. And what started to happen is we've like completely forgotten that second bit, right? We're all about accountability and canceling people and stuff like that, which there may be good reasons for. I'm not saying that there aren't good reasons to do that. I'm just saying that there's another piece to it. It's an incomplete equation. Make sense? Is controlling emotions different from not letting emotions control you? That's a great question, Hammy. Great segue to our next topic. So, yeah, I think controlling emotions is different from not letting emotions control you. Generally speaking, when people say controlling emotions, I tend to think about something like suppression. Now, what do people mean by that? It could be variable, but I tend to think about control, like someone who says like, I'm in control of my emotions. Like oftentimes they will use a lot of suppression, whereas not letting emotions control you, I think is better. I mean, maybe that they mean the same thing depending on who you're talking to. But what I think about is being aware of emotions, feeling your emotions, and having some distance between your emotions and your actions. Whereas controlling your emotions oftentimes means suppressing. You can get into stuff like toxic positivity and like things like that. You can get displacement and all kinds of weird stuff. So I think about controlling emotions as like more psychological defense mechanisms. And not letting emotions control you is like being aware, acknowledging it, feeling it, but also having some distance between action and emotion. So Burundi is saying, I don't have a strong opinion of myself, so I don't think I can separate myself from other people's opinions. That's a very challenging and common problem. So it's tricky. So we know that, for example, like in extreme versions of that, we'll get into something called cluster B personality disorders, right? So when people have that, whatever you're describing, where they have a poor sense of self, that's when the opinions of others matter a lot. So we see that in things like borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. I'm not saying you have those, just for the record. Be careful with what I said. I said in extreme versions of that, we call those cluster B personality disorders. So it's common. And that's where, like, you know, if you meet those clinical criteria or you're wondering about that, by all means, go get evaluated. But on the flip side, not knowing who you are and not knowing who you are and not having a strong opinion of yourself is not a clinical thing. That's like a human journey that every single human being goes through, discovering who you are and your identity. And for that kind of stuff, I think like stuff like the Atmanpada from the meditation guide and things like that, like we talk about ego-related meditations and development of ego and stuff like that. That's where all that comes in. Okay? Okay. let's talk about emotional courage. Leaked. Okay. How to have the courage to open up. I've noticed for a long time that I have a habit of bottling things up and dealing with things on my own, such that in the past I was prone to easily isolate myself and dismiss any uncomfortable emotions since I didn't quite understand the act of acknowledging and being present with it. I believe I've gotten better since I found a system where I would immediately journal my thoughts and feelings away whenever things arise. I also resist the urge to isolate from other people, however. However, I still have a super hard time allowing myself to be vulnerable and ask help to process out my true feelings. I still have the strong sense of not wanting to burden people about my problems, nor I never think they're worthy to be shared since I feel silly to do so. It's like I know the steps on how to make myself feel better and rely on myself, but why can't I also allow myself to lean on someone else too? I feel like I know the right answer to this already. It's like I've read so many self-help books, but I know I can't do everything on my own. Maybe this is my way of sharing and wanting some form of help, or just to process things out. I already have the urge of wanting to delete this post later and process it by myself, but it'd be nice if there are tips to challenge the thoughts of not wanting to be vulnerable with people. So I love this post from our Discord. I love it because this is exactly what I'm happy to see in our community, which is like, okay, so we start off and we don't know our emotions. I don't know how I feel, right? I'm like unfamiliar with emotions. I like don't like the way that I feel. And so we start like working on our emotions internally because that's where emotions exist, right? They're in here. So I start working on emotions and then I learn how to journal and stuff. I become more emotionally aware. And even in the case of this person, they also become aware that I want to delete this. But there comes a point where like, as we're exploring our emotions, there's like this very big divide. There's like a cliff of I'm totally fine exploring emotions by myself, but I can't lean on other people. I can't open up to other people. I can't burden other people. Right? It's all got to be by myself. And if we pay attention to this post, you may be similar in the sense that you're also thinking about like self-help books, right? How do I do this on my own? I become emotionally aware on my own, but I still can't open up to other people. So what do we do about this? So what I'm going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about why this happens. And we're going to share with y'all 5 things that you can do. And the 5th of which is quite revolutionary. The first 4 may be things that you've sort of thought of or worked on in some way. But it's really the 5th one that I think is going to like be quite different, okay? And it's going to completely reconceptualize how you think about this. The other cool thing is that the 5th one will help a lot because it'll transform the way that you think about this. So number 1 is be aware of your own emotions. So this person has already done this. So they've sort of recognized that in order to have a discussion with someone else about emotions, we have to be aware of what we're feeling, right? It's very hard to have a discussion with someone when we don't even know what we feel. That's actually part of the reason that we have discussions with people, by the way, is to figure out what we feel. But it starts with some amount of awareness of your own emotions. So like this person does, you can journal or something like that, but just start to like think a little bit about, okay, like what am I feeling right now? Is it physical? Is it mental? Where in space, like, am I feeling a negative emotion or a positive emotion? Why am I feeling this way? So you have to have some amount of awareness of emotions. Second thing is you've got to start small. So when it comes to awareness of emotions, there's this thing called the emotions wheel or the feelings wheel, which someone made up. I don't know exactly who. I've seen lots of iterations. And so there are all kinds of like emotions, right? So we can figure out negative emotions, positive emotions. There's stuff like shame, anger. But in terms of anger, there can be all kinds of anger. There can be a sense of feeling betrayed. There can be self-loathing. There can be anger towards other people. There can be feelings of unfairness. There are all kinds of emotions, sub-emotions that we're not really aware of at the very beginning. Most of what we feel is angry. So if we want to understand our own emotions and how to be able to open up, we've got to kind of start small and kind of meet ourselves where we're at. So I'd start by even asking yourself something simple like, are you experiencing a positive emotion or a negative emotion? What's the color of the negative emotion? Is it angry? Is it frustration? Is it shame? Is it fear? Is it sadness? Is it worry? And this is where there's a tip I'll give you, which is that oftentimes frustration is the first thing that we feel, but frustration is usually an umbrella emotion that covers other emotions. So when I say I'm frustrated, like I'm frustrated by not being invited to parties. I'm frustrated that my friends always forget to invite me. But if you really dig underneath that, that's an umbrella emotion. What I really feel is like lonely. What I really feel is devalued, right? So there's a lot of stuff kind of under there. So start small, start wherever you are, and start to kind of dig in a little bit slowly. Okay? Other thing to consider when it comes to emotions and opening up is that when we feel some kind of negative emotion, we feel vulnerable. And when we feel vulnerable, we feel like hiding or isolating. This is like a primordial human response. Anytime we're vulnerable, we're going to feel like isolating, pulling back, because we don't want to show those kinds of things. Even in terms of if you look at like the anthropology, like anthropological perspectives on mental health, historically, we've hidden mental illness. Why do we have a stigma against mental illness? It's because for a long time, like historically, like when people are mentally ill, we sort of consider that a vulnerability. We sort of consider it shaming. And so we try to hide those kinds of things. So, it's okay to talk about positive emotions. Yeah, I'm happy today. I'm courageous. I'm a good person. This is a success. But when it comes to sadness and being angry and being frustrated and being ashamed, we oftentimes don't share those kinds of things and we feel like isolating. Now, there's a good reason for that. It's not just anthropological. It's not just historical. It's also because oftentimes when we share negative emotions, what's the response that we get? We paradoxically frequently get an invalidating response. Oh, I don't feel like I'm attractive. And then your friends, because they're your friends and they care about you, will say, oh, you're crazy. You're beautiful. How could you not feel attractive? You're so amazing. How could you be so stupid that you don't realize how beautiful you are? What is wrong with you? How can you be so idiotic? You're amazing and you don't even see it? So it's paradoxical, but oftentimes when we share negative emotions, oddly enough, people are actually quite devaluing. So that's where we sort of learn this. It's kind of weird. So when you're trained to become a psychiatrist and we learn how to talk to people who are suicidal, when someone says, I'm suicidal, what we sort of get trained in is not to say, oh, you're crazy. Like you have so much to live for. Don't you see that? It's to actually ask them, hey, what makes you suicidal? Like, help me understand why you're thinking about ending your life. And they'll say, well, my kids don't respect me. I'm losing my job. I feel like my wife and I are growing apart and it's only a matter of time before she divorces me. And then interestingly enough, sort of the right thing to say, sort of textbook wise, is to say, wow, I can totally understand why someone in your situation would feel the way that you do. Because it sounds like you're being separated from your family. It sounds like you're afraid of a divorce. It sounds like you care a lot about your marriage and you're afraid it's going to end. So we can be very validating, which is not usually how people respond to us when we share negative emotions. So there is this very natural instinct, and this is the third thing to understand, is that the instinct is to isolate, especially when we feel vulnerable. So the next thing that we can kind of look at is understanding why we have a fear of opening up in the first place. So for a lot of people who are afraid to open up to other people, what we discover is that there's somewhere in their life where they did open up and they they didn't get the answer that they were looking for. So sometimes we grow up in households where people are not very emotionally supportive, and it's actually very devastating to express emotions. So, for example, I remember when my dad passed away, all of the men from our social circle told me to be strong. And they're like, be strong, Alok, be strong, be strong, be strong. Now it's time for you to be strong, be strong, be strong, be strong. And I was like, I didn't really understand what that meant. I didn't understand what being weak in this situation, what does that mean? Right? Is that When people come over and I'm carrying a pitcher of water over to like serve people who are visiting after my dad passed away, does being strong mean I'm going to fill up 4 pitchers and like carry 4 pitchers because I'm going to be strong? Or does it mean like, what does that even mean? So oftentimes, especially in my culture, it sort of means like, don't express negative emotion. So for people who have difficulty opening up, let's understand this. So if you are trying to open up to someone else and you feel afraid, where does the brain and the mind learn fear? Right? So we have some kinds of instinctive fears. So like human beings are instinctively afraid of like snakes, for example. But when it comes to interpersonal interactions, a lot of the fears that we have are based on our experiences. So if you want sort of understanding and you want power over your ability to open up, what you've really got to understand is, where does this come from? Where did you learn to be afraid of opening up? And as you sort of discover that, it can change your perspective in the moment, because then you realize, okay, like I actually don't have a problem opening up to this person now. There's a part of my mind that is warning me based on the past that sometimes this hasn't gone well. So like I acknowledge that now, like my mind is on high alert and it's actually looking out for me. Once you recognize that that's what your mind is doing, it'll help you open up a lot. The last thing that we're going to talk about, and this is the one that's kind of bizarre, but will hopefully change your perspective completely. So when we look at this post on opening up, let's take a quick look. I want to point out a couple things to you. The first is how to have the courage to open up. So how does this person think about opening up? They think about it as a weakness that needs to be overcome, right? There's negative emotion right here. Second thing is I have a strong sense of not wanting to burden people about my problems. And that's very common, right? I don't think they're worthy. So I don't want to burden another human being. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to journal. I'm going to become aware. I want to feel better and rely on myself. So if we look at opening up to other humans, it's kind of weird, but we think about it as an internal thing. How do I have the courage to open up? How do I overcome this weakness? I don't want to burden other people. So here's the key thing to understand. When it comes to opening up to other people, it's no longer a solo game. Suddenly there's a relational component. So when you say, I don't want to burden other people, that's where the way that you resolve that is not through courage. You don't overcome your fears of burdening other people. There's a relational component. So what you do is talk to them. Ask for permission. Ask for feedback. Hey, is it okay, ask for permission, if I talk to you about something that's like I'm struggling with right now? So the whole point of opening up to another human being is there's a relational component to it. It now involves more than one person. And what we try to do is solve all the anxieties in our head without ever interacting with the other person. And so here I am trying to overcome all these like, oh my God, I don't want to burden people. How do I get over this feeling of not wanting to burden people? Whereas like you can deal with it very, very easily if you just ask them, hey, when I talked to you last week about, how I'm having trouble with my significant other, did you feel like that issue was silly or did you feel burdened by it? I sometimes feel guilty because like I'll talk to you about things and, I don't think like you can actually do anything to help me. Is it okay if I have that kind of conversation with you? How does it feel when we talk about something like this? Do you feel burdened? Do you think this is silly? Like what's going on there? Like what's your experience of this conversation? And so the cool thing is that you don't actually have to have the courage to like overcome all that stuff. Since this is relational, you can just ask the other person, hey, is it okay for us to talk a little bit? I've got something going on right now and I kind of need to unload. And what's really cool is that this person is actually doing this. I feel like I know the right answer. I've read so much self-help and do everything on my own. Maybe this is my way of sharing or just to process things. I already have the urge of wanting to delete this. Basically, this person is asking for permission on Discord. They're practicing it right here. Is it okay that I'm doing this? And so this is the key thing to really understand about having the courage to open up with other people is that like at the end of the day, you don't have to figure it out all on your own. That's the whole advantage about having a relationship, is that you can ask for permission. And once they give you the green light, it'll do so much for your internal anxieties. Because anytime you're struggling to open up with someone, I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but you're struggling with two things. One is the thing that you want to talk about, and one is the additional emotional burden of like putting it on someone else. And so the reason it's so hard is because you're carrying both of these emotional burdens. There's not only the original thing, which is hard to deal with, there's like, now I've got to burden someone else with it. I got to feel silly, and there's all this other crap. And this is what actually gets in the way. And so by sort of asking for permission, by asking for feedback, by acknowledging that this is a relationship, by not trying to solve all this on your own, you can actually deal with this completely just by asking for permission. And then like you come over here and then you can share your thing. The cool thing is that when you do this, it actually can deepen your relationship, right? So that's where afterward, there should also be feedback from you. Hey, I really appreciate you talking to me last week. I felt a lot better. Thank you so much. So instead of feeling guilty, appreciate. And then say, hey, my door's always open. If there's anything that you want to talk about, I'm happy to listen. And then like now you've done something really cool, which is that you've crossed this bridge and then you've left it open for them to cross back. And that's how you deepen relationships. And as you form deeper relationships, it becomes easier to open up, right? So that's how to really get the ball rolling. So it's a really common problem that people have in terms of not having the courage to open up. And it starts with some pretty simple stuff, which is all internal, right? So having awareness of what you're feeling, being able to sort of identify, sit with what you're feeling, etc. Discovering kind of is starting really small, sort of discovering the source of discomfort, discovering where you learned that opening up is a bad idea. But the thing that's really going to be a game changer is that oftentimes as we open up, there's a relational component that we don't consider. We think that overcoming this fear of opening up is something I have to do on my own. But the whole point is that when we're opening up, there's a relational element to it. There's another human being, and they can help you with that. So ask for permission, ask for feedback, express appreciation. That'll make it way easier. Questions? Lesbian04 say, I'm so happy I discovered Dr. K a few days ago. Welcome, Lesbian04. Okay, this is a good question. The legend of Mercurius is saying, how do we motivate someone else to open up when they seem closed off or isolated? So, when someone else seems closed off or isolated, we don't necessarily want to motivate them. What we want them to do is feel safe. So what I'd say is like the way that you get people to open up is by opening a door for them and letting them walk through it if they want to or not. You just want to make it clear to them that the door is open for them. So oddly enough, like I think it's almost like instead of motivating them, we want to be like a vacuum, right? So we want to create like a negative space where they can come in and fill it in if they feel like it. So it's about making them feel safe as opposed to motivating them to open up. The other thing that you can do if someone's closed off is just ask them, hey, I'm noticing that you're a little bit quieter today. Do you just need a little bit of space? Or are you like doing okay? Like, or is there something that, anything I can help with? So just kind of don't assume what's going on, but just point out the observation. Like just make an observation, which is that, hey, I'm noticing you're quieter today. If there's something going on, happy to help. And if you're just kind of taking it easy today, that's totally fine too. Right? So we want to open the door. We want to give them the opportunity to walk through it. I wouldn't go digging and trying to get them to open up. So Rockwell is asking, what if I don't ask for permission? If I open up, throw my stuff at someone else and only ask how they felt about it at the end? That's totally fine, right? So it's not ideal, but I think it's completely acceptable. So like if you unload on that, I wouldn't ask them right then and there. I'd actually circle back the next day and say, hey, I kind of opened up, in the future, like maybe I should check in with you before I do that. What was that like for you? That's what so like, here's the thing. A lot of times when it comes to interpersonal interactions, we try to be perfect from the get-go. right? Like we try to be like, okay, I'm going to do A, B, C, D, E in this order and it's going to be perfect. Thing about relationships is that like people don't behave perfectly. It's totally fine to go back later and try to fix something if you think it was a problem. Now that doesn't, well, is some of the damage done? Sure. Are people not going to like it? Potentially. But like the strategy that you want is the one that's going to, be the best for the most number of people, which is like, you can always apologize for something later if you don't think you handled it well. If anything, it'll signal to the person that you're thoughtful about things, aren't going to let things slip under the rug, and that you value the relationship. If someone comes to you and says, hey, I'm sorry, if I screwed something up, just kind of checking in. Like, how is that person going to receive that? Hopefully they'll receive that as, oh, like this person values this relationship and they're thoughtful about it. And they'll hopefully try to maintain it. How do you deal with the guilt of shutting someone down who opens up too much with you? Great question. So I think that's where, how can I say this? So sometimes we have a friend who opens up too much. And we have to remember what the role of the relationship is. So if this is a friend, friendships tend to be reciprocal. And sometimes what happens is people who have emotional needs will get their emotional needs met through a relationship, which is part of what a relationship is, but sometimes it becomes a primary part of the relationship, or it becomes, this is what's more devastating, the primary way we get our emotional needs met. So I'll give you all just a simple example. I've worked with some people who are kind of like codependent, or at least one person is dependent. And so this person has a strong feeling of loneliness, right? I'm terrified of being alone. And so what they can do is actually smother their partner, because then their romantic partner is not just a romantic partner. The romantic partner has the burden of solving my loneliness. And once I place that burden on them and they set any kind of limits with me, they're going to feel guilty. Because now if they say no to me, now I'm feeling alone. Whereas the real problem is that the romantic partner is there to alleviate some amount of loneliness. But when it comes to our own emotional needs, another human being is not responsible for all of them. And so if you're shutting someone down who, is opening up too much to you, that's where you've got to start thinking a little bit about your own emotional needs and what's the limit of this relationship. And it's okay to have a boundary around that and still care about the person. This is what's really confusing to people, is a lot of times people will feel guilty for setting a boundary. So I care about my patients a lot. We do a lot of really, really deep work together, but I also don't invite them over for Christmas because that's not appropriate. And some of them are alone during Christmas. And do I feel a little bit guilty for that? Yes. And at the same time, there's like a boundary between, my family and my patients, even though I care about them both. And so in that same way, you can set limits on people and then you may feel guilty. And that's where I don't think it's, it's about understanding, okay, why do I feel guilty? How did we fall into this situation where I have become the primary source of venting for this person? The other reason that you can feel guilty is because oftentimes when someone becomes when someone is venting on you in a very dependent way, it doesn't actually improve their life over time. So they'll come to you, they'll vent. A day goes by, a week goes by, they're venting. A month goes by, they're venting. 6 months go by, they're venting. A year goes by, they're venting. And they've started to become so dependent on you as an emotional dumping ground that they don't actually take the steps in their life to prevent those emotions from piling up again. Does that make sense? And so that can be then you can start burning out as a friend, and then you have to set limits on that because they're totally fine because they've found someone to take out the trash. So they keep on accumulating single-use plastics at an astronomical rate because they've got you coming to their house every day and emptying the trash. And then if you don't show up to empty the trash, then their house fills up with trash. And then you feel guilty because you've somehow stepped into the role of being responsible for keeping their house clean. So it's really tricky. But try to understand, how did this pattern develop? What is really my role in this relationship? Some of it is emotional support, but is this reciprocal? Is this person becoming dependent on me? Right? And the other thing to acknowledge is that you have emotions and needs too. And you don't have to be a dumping ground for someone else. Okay, so for meditation for the day, I want to share something cool with y'all. So we're going to learn a meditation about, let me see if I can find this. No. Let me see. Hold on. This is ASMR. Hold on a second, chat. Bear with me. Oh, map of subjective feelings. Yeah. Okay. So we've got, I have something very, very exciting for y'all, chat. Hold on, let me make sure I find it. Okay. Okay, so we're going to do a meditation today about emotions, okay? And what we're going to do is recognize the physicality of emotions. So a lot of people don't really know what they're feeling. And that makes a lot of sense because we don't really teach people how to name what they're feeling, how to isolate what they're feeling. So it turns out that there's a paper from our favorite journal, PNAS, the Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences, okay, that talks about the maps of subjective feelings. So the cool thing is they looked at 100 emotions. And what they did is actually look at where these emotions or experiences map onto the body. So blue is negative emotion, for example. So social exclusion is felt here and here. Ostracism is felt here and here. Panic is felt somewhere else. Disgust is felt somewhere else. Despise something, hostility, losing is felt somewhere else. Shame is felt somewhere else. Do you guys see how each of these is actually like a little bit different? So what we're going to do today is y'all can, this is a paper that's in the public domain, so y'all can download it. It's called Maps of Subjective Feelings. But there's also other kinds of emotions that we can feel, like, illnesses will create certain things. There are also places where we feel homeostatic feelings, like hunger, thirst, feeling full. And then there's some like other weird things like being dazzled, sleeping, vitality, urinating, forgetting. Where do we feel forgetting in our body? Where do we forget in our body? There are cognitive experiences as well. There are positive emotions, like where's laughing, where's happiness. So laughing is more in the belly. Happiness is more in the heart. Pleasure is actually more in the head. Love is also like more diffusely through the heart. Sexual arousal is, I guess, not surprising, in the loins. Where do we feel longing for? Social longing. So all of these things, there's actually been a study where they've mapped this to a particular part of the body. Like, that's pretty cool, right? So what we're going to do is actually combine this with a meditation. So what I want y'all to do the next time you're trying to understand something about emotions, what I want y'all to do is adopt a meditative posture and notice where in the body you feel the emotion. So there are two ways to do this practice. One is when you're feeling emotional, if you can actually take a break and do a quick meditative practice, what I do is sit up straight, okay? Back straight, neck straight, head straight. We're going to close our eyes, and we want to be careful here because we don't necessarily want to do a whole lot of controlled breathing, because there's evidence that shows that breathing is associated with the alteration of emotion. This is why we'll sort of tell people to take 3 deep breaths and things like that. So we want to be very careful about controlling our breathing. So we don't actually want to breathe deep. We just want to close our eyes and notice whatever sensations arise as we feel a negative emotion. So this is going to be tricky because when you close your eyes, the first thing that you're going to want to do is breathe. So if you find that closing your eyes alters your breathing, you can actually open your eyes and just focus on the sensation. So try to really do a scan from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet. And just notice what signals you're getting from your body in this moment. And then we'll also go into the second way to do this practice, which is if you're not feeling emotional in the moment, you can recall a period of time, hopefully recently, where you felt very emotional, and really try to remember what it was like to be in that moment. And what I want you all to do is be very methodical. Start at the top of your head. Kind of notice, in my head, am I feeling something? And go to the throat, even top of the throat, middle of the throat, bottom of the throat. Move to the chest. And try to notice, is it more on the left or the right? Is it more on the outside of the chest or more centrally? You feel it more in the front or in the back? And then move down to the stomach, the abdomen. And where do you feel it in the abdomen? Once again, more on the outside, more in the center, top or bottom. Deep in the stomach or more on the surface? Where exactly is the pit of your stomach? Where do you feel the butterflies of your stomach? And then you can go to the limbs. Arms, legs. You may notice tension in the back, the desire to clench your fists. And even in your body, maybe like in your back, the desire to curl in. Just notice where you scan your body and try to find whatever feeling you can put your hands on. And remember, you don't have to figure out what the feeling is. Just scan the body. And now that you've isolated it, you may notice, first of all, that this process alleviates it some, which is okay. Side benefit, I suppose, is alleviates your negative emotions or positive emotions. Remember, you can do this with negative or positive emotions. So if y'all have a pet or child or something like that, or a loved one, and you're kind of laying down and they're like laying with you and you feel peaceful and content, like where do you feel that contentment? If you're laying on the beach and you're content, where does that contentment exist within you? And then the cool thing is that y'all can go to this paper from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and then you can map it on and you can see, okay, like where is this emotion actually existing? So where did you feel it? So we may notice that like aching, shivering, itching, so these are all physical sensations. But that social exclusion and ostracism have slightly different locations, right? Loneliness, depression, even loneliness is like a little bit different. So social exclusion is a little bit more faint. Loneliness is a little bit more in the head and stronger over here. Ostracism is stronger over here, but a little bit less so in the head. So even between these three kinds of things, we can actually feel like subtle differences. And this is a great way to like understand what your emotions are. Because if you're someone who struggles to like put names to your emotions, even, ostracism versus social isolation versus loneliness, we may jumble all those three things up together. So by using techniques like this, we can start to increase the sophistication of our emotional measurements. And as we increase the sophistication of our emotional measurements, we'll gain awareness over them. And if we agree with the yogis, awareness is the first step to control or power over something. And the simplest way to understand that is like, even if we're talking about emotions, when we numb things through practices like video games, pornography, and whatnot, substances of abuse, as we numb those things, all of those feelings kind of go away. But even though they go subsurface, they continue to exert their presence on us, right? They continue to impact our motivation. They continue to make us isolated because we're ashamed of how we compare to other people at this party. And they continue to subtly influence all aspects of our life. And so if we want to reverse that process, if you want to get over this, it starts by sort of understanding your emotions. The other really cool thing that happens is when we do this practice and we're able to like discover our emotions, what we're actually doing is calling them up and not retreating from them. And as we call up emotions and don't retreat from them, this gives us the added advantage of being able to tolerate emotions, because people will ask, how do I sit with emotion? It's so painful. And this is going to be a beautiful way to start sitting with emotion, because that's what you're literally doing. You're calling it up. You're summoning a negative emotion so that you can explore it. And if you do that enough, then what you'll realize and discover is, oh, actually, this is a thing that does not need to be feared. I do not need to fear social isolation. And paradoxically, it's the social isolation that actually keeps you at home. It's that emotion which controls the behavior. So many benefits can sort of bloom out of an increased awareness of your emotions. And this is a great technique to start with that. Skellytoon is saying, could you please shout out the community challenge? We need some help. Absolutely. So we're doing in September. It's tough, chat. So for those of you that don't know, we are doing a community challenge of connecting the dots in September. And let me see if I can find... Okay. So the community has entered phase 3. Let's take a look. Uh-oh. Please show the board via stream. Hold on. Let's see if this works. Can I sign into this Miro board? Okay, so it seems like it took one clue for the community to solve phase 1 and 2. No access to the board. GG. Oh, no, wait. Nah. Okay, looks like I don't have access to the Miro board. It looks like there's a Miro board. Okay. So we're doing a Connect the Dots challenge. And let me just show y'all what this means. So... Okay, so this is a hard one, okay? This is something new that we're doing. So we've had a couple of awesome community challenges so far. So now we're doing Connect the Dots, which is a scavenger hunt that spans everywhere you can find HG. There are 6 phases and 6 rewards, and y'all have to work together to unlock the clues, okay? So phase 1 is a new stream emote. I guess we've done that. Phase 2 is new merch. Phase 3 is Dr. K dresses as a monk for stream. And I guess that's what we're looking to unlock. So there are events that are going on that y'all can sort of check out. Ask a Coach and Social Sandbox, where we drop hints to solve the challenge. Y'all can check Discord for a detailed schedule. Hints will only be dropped live, so we're not going to record hints or upload them anywhere. Okay? There are also weekly challenges. So this is our subtle way of trying to trick y'all into doing things that are good for yourself. And that involves... You have to have a unique challenge, but a large number of people have to complete it, like cleaning stuff, meditating, journaling, etc. Okay? And then it's designed to be a collaborative effort, so you can't do it on your own. All right? So you've got to meditate, and a bunch of other people have to meditate. If we can get enough people to meditate, we'll get clues, we'll solve problems, we'll unlock stuff. Make sense? So now what we're going to do is actually, we've got Ask a Coach on social anxiety at 2 p.m. today. So when y'all, if y'all are interested in learning more about social anxiety, you know, practicing social skills and whatnot, y'all are welcome to join Ask a Coach. It's actually live right now. And for once in our life, we are actually done close enough on time to where it's still going on. So check it out. And for the rest of y'all, if y'all are not interested in doing that, we're actually not going to raid someone today. We're going to just head over to Ask a Coach. And for the rest of y'all, by all means, meditate, journal, do something else. Okay? So hop onto the Discord. Let me see if I can hop on myself. Let's see. I think, though, I have to mute it because sometimes when I've joined Discord on stream, things do not go well. Alas. Let's see. Okay, so it seems like there are 112 people on Ask a Coach right now. 109, 110. So let me see if I can.
Just a lot more noticeable when you're on one-on-one or when you're in small groups. Now, I think there might be something a little bit different going on, or there might be other factors here, because you mentioned it's not just, it doesn't seem to just be the size of the groups. It also seems to be social context. But I see this a lot. So coaching work with political candidates, it's often
we're not going to continue to stream that segment because there, you know, people may not want to do that, but so it's going on right now. So check it out if y'all are interested in learning more about social related stuff. Okay. And we'll see y'all on Friday, I believe. Okay. So take care, everybody. Have a nice day. Oh, I can open the board through this link. Let's see. That's okay. We'll head out. Check out Ask a Coach if y'all want to, okay? We'll see y'all on Friday, everybody. Take care.